All right, let's talk about intermediate sanctions. These are penalties that fall between probation and prison or jail. They're usually community based, such as a more intense form of supervision or home confinement, for example. There's a growing trend to add additional sanctions to traditional probation sentences. There's several advantages of intermediate sanctions. It's less costly to the government. It allows offenders to maintain family and community ties. They can scale, the sanctions can scale in severity depending on the conviction. They increase control over probationer who is at risk to repeat their crimes or to reoffend. They can be used to punish violators of probation while allowing them to remain on probation, and I've touched on this one already. So what are these intermediate sanctions? Well, there's a bunch of them. There's some that include programs that are administered by the probation departments, such as intense supervision, house arrest, GPS tracking, restitution orders, split sentence, and shock probation. Some involve sentences administered independently of probation, meaning probation doesn't have to be involved, such as fines, forfeiture, pretrial services, and residential programs. Intermediate sanctions can be in successive steps as the scale of punishments go. They can start very small or lenient and then work their way up. And we'll look at, there's a picture in the book of a ladder, page 258. We'll look at it after we go through each one of these in detail. And you can see, the progression that takes place from the least intrusive to highly intrusive or even restrictive on a person. We'll go over it, but let's go through each one of these sanctions. Fines, monetary punishment, right? Basically, it's to compensate the public or society for the offender's misdeeds. Fines can be imposed on any type of crime. In some instances, they're mandatory. For example, DWI has a mandatory fine that the court must impose. Otherwise, fine is usually in the court's discretion, and a range in the fine amount is dictated by law, depending on what the crime is. Offenders who are required to pay a fine don't face jail time for non-payment in the state of New York. The Supreme Court has said that putting people in jail who cannot pay is discriminating against the poor, but guess what? It does happen. Some places are experimenting with something called day fines, which is geared towards the offender's daily net income, like what they can afford to pay, versus just, here, pay this $2,000 fine by the end of the day, which happens. People can go to jail for not paying fines. Some court, even despite the fact that the Supreme Court has said what they said about, incarcerating people who can't be fined because it's discriminating against the poor, it does unfortunately happen, and it becomes a revolving door. Forfeiture is another example of a sanction. This is a civil procedure. It allows the government to seize goods, money, any instrumentality related to the commission or outcome of a criminal act. So, for example, the drug money that was found on someone who was selling drugs could be seized by the government. The seizure of a car used to traffic drugs, or a seizure of a home where meth was being made. That happens, especially at the federal level. Actually, the book references some examples of the feds using forfeiture, and they use it all the time, the federal government. And while it is technically a proceeding that the government or the district attorney has to begin, most tie the forfeiture in with a plea bargaining. I had a case where the individual was charged with trafficking drugs, pulled over a vehicle, found the drugs in the car, and the law enforcement wanted the particular car. They actually wanted it because they wanted to use it in their drug operations or the drug stings. It was a perfect kind of car for that. And so my client agreed to surrender the car, and he didn't spend any time in jail. So that's how the state government likes to use forfeiture. The federal government is not so, doesn't play that game. They'll just come and take it. This practice is highly criticized when used by the feds because the government tends to be overzealous in their takings. They'll take $1 million yacht just because somebody possessed cocaine while sailing on it. They call it zero tolerance. So if you break the law, we're taking any instrumentality that is the result of that or was used in the commission of a crime. And the argument is that the taking is disproportionate to the crime in most cases, especially taking homes from people. But they do. It's also looked at as a conflict of interest. The government seizes the money, in some cases, to supplement their budgets. The car that I just told you about, law enforcement wanted to use it for drug buys to catch other drug dealers. They have a conflict of interest when they're doing something like that. Restitution. This is an order by the court as part of the sentence. Basically, it is an order directing the offender to pay back the victim and the community. There's two forms: the monetary restitution, that's paying back the victim, making the victim whole. If it was an assault and there was hospital bills, offender would be responsible for paying those back. If it was theft of property or damage to property, the offender would have to make good on those items. And there's a whole number of other things that could constitute restitution. If the victim required therapy after whatever the crime was, as a result, that would be something the offender would have to pay back, and that would be court ordered. The other thing is community service. They just call it community service, but it's community service restitution. It requires the offender to work in the community, to give the community something of value. It's especially true when you have very wealthy people, and they can totally pay a fine. They can totally dole out some money. It actually makes them have to contribute. I'm not saying they're the only people who get community service, but that is kind of the difference, to give back to the community for doing something illegal. And then we have shock probation and split sentencing. They're kind of the same. These are other alternatives which grants offenders community release, but only after they've had a little sample of being locked up time or prison time in one case. So it's based on the idea that if the offender gets a taste of being incarcerated, they will be reluctant to violate probation rules or to reoffend. Now, the shock probation, which is usually about 90 days, the offender does a short prison term before they begin their probation. On a split sentence, the offender spends time in jail, a local jail, not a prison, incarcerated in a local jail before starting probation. And that's usually 6 months or less time. And then we have intensive probation supervision, or ISP. New York uses this form of probation. A central premise of ISP is that it provides closer supervision by frequent contact between offenders and officers and greater restrictions on the freedom of the offenders. Offenders on ISP have far more contact with their officer than those on regular probation. They may be in contact several times per week with interactions at the probation office and the offender's home and place of employment. Due to the increased supervision, ISP officers have smaller caseloads. The number may vary, but typically it's no more than 40 offenders. The type of offender on ISP is usually one that's deemed a high risk, but they may also exclude folks like drug dealers or those convicted of violent felonies, so it's discretionary. The primary goals of intensive probation supervision, IPS, I think I said ISP before, IPS, decarceration, reduces the prison population. So without this intensive probation supervision, these offenders would be sent to prison. Control. close scrutiny of high-risk offenders. Reintegration. This is where the offenders, again, they get to maintain their community ties and be with their family by being on a more intensive probation supervision. House arrest is another form of intermediate sanction. Just like it sounds, you're remaining confined to one's home, usually requiring the offender to wear a tracking device so probation may monitor the offender. This is usually used in conjunction with both levels of probation, but more often with the intensive probation supervision. Now, electronic home monitoring, that's the tracking device that is used in order for house arrest to work. So while random calling and checking in do happen, and it's a part of house arrest, requiring an offender to actually wear a device enables probation to ensure that the offender is in compliance. It's a bracelet, it's usually around the ankle, and it's a tamper-proof bracelet. Those are pretty hardcore, and actually if you would try to tamper with it, it sets an alarm off at the message center. So a receiver detects the transmitter's signal and it conveys a message to a central computer is how that works, and data comes off of it with regards to the use. So if the offender begins to tamper with it or sticks, like foil or something trying to shut it off, it will flag as being tampered. GPS, Global Positioning System, another form of monitoring offenders. This ensures that the probation officer knows what the offender is doing at all times and making sure that the offender is not engaging in any risky behavior or putting themselves in any risky places or situations. And then finally, we have residential community corrections, and this is the most secure intermediate sanction. The residential community corrections facilities, they're an alternative to prison. They're intended to help offenders return to their communities. Offenders that meet the acceptance requirements are placed in residential programs instead of prison. The residential programs provide a structured environment where offenders live under supervision but are allowed to leave the facility to go to work, attend treatment for mental health issues or substance abuse, and reconnect with family and the community. This is a common system for the juvenile justice system. Benefits, well, it costs taxpayers less than incarceration. The offender's employment offsets the costs of housing and treatment and allows payment of child support or restitution to the victims. So they work with the offender, making sure child support and any restitution gets paid, and while the offender is working, they're paying for some of their housing costs and treatment. So after release from residential community correction, the offender is typically transitioned from the residential programs to non-residential programs that provide treatment in the community at a lower level of supervision before they're ultimately allowed to be in the community without any supervision. So those are all of the sanctions, types of sanctions, and here was the ladder that's in the book. So how the ladder works with regards to severity of these punishments. The first one at the bottom is restorative justice, and I know we haven't talked about that. That's the next topic. We'll discuss it in a moment, but basically it's a type of program where the offender, victim, and the community work together on helping or rehabilitating the offender through alternative dispute resolution. So this is before it even hits the system, the criminal justice system. They're trying to see if the matter can be resolved. And then the next step up the ladder is pretrial release. Now we've talked about pretrial release in the court section. This is where the offender is supervised in the community while their case is pending. So there is some level of supervision at this point. The case has reached the court, and now we have a period of where the conviction has happened and the court has sentenced the individual, and so the first easy sentence there. The next one on the ring, in least of severity, is the monetary punishment of fines. And then we have forfeit, and it doesn't have to be one, or it could be a combination of these things. Forfeiture, that's giving up the instrumentalities or goods that were used in the commission of a crime or were the benefit of the commission of a crime, like money in a drug deal. And then there's probation. Somebody's placed on probation. The judge will require somebody to pay restitution, which is collected by probation. There's regular probation, but an individual can be on a more intensive term of probation with intensive supervision, meeting with their probation more often, having to do some more things per their terms and conditions. They can also be subjected to house arrest and electronic monitoring, which is electronic monitoring, very similar to GPS. The electronic monitoring, however, I believe needs to work in a home because there has to be a base set somewhere. You can't get too far away from the base, otherwise it kind of detaches itself. You can't get a signal. So the house arrest and electronic monitoring kind of go hand in hand. We do not use the term house arrest in New York. We actually call it electronic home monitoring, but it's the same thing. So then you have your residential community center shock probation, because you're doing at least 90 days in prison before you're being released back to probation. And then there's ultimately prison, and then obviously the worst form of a sanction is the death penalty. So that is our sanctions before getting to incarceration. Before we get, the next chapter will be about corrections and being incarcerated and prison itself. But before we get there, there's one more topic. It's restorative justice, and that's not all that long, but that will complete our chapter.